Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs. Tonight, we begin not in a city nor a village, but somewhere much quieter, under a cold stone ceiling lit only by flickering firelight. Before kings, before temples, before even the wheel, there were humans, just like us, huddled near a fire, trying to survive another night. There's a strange comfort in imagining them, these ancient ancestors of ours, crouched in the mouth of a cave, flint tools beside them, meat roasting on a spit, and the sky beyond scattered with stars they didn't yet name. They didn't speak in empires or laws or money. They spoke in gestures, in grunts, in fire-crackled storytelling that left no trace, but built the beginning of everything. We call them hunter-gatherers, but that phrase barely captures the fullness of their world. They were wanderers, seasonal souls, moving with the herds and the rains, collecting roots, berries, and wisdom. They knew the land intimately, where the elk migrated, when the snow would fall, what berries would nourish and which ones would kill. They survived ice ages, outpaced predators, and forged tools, not just of stone but of bone, antler, and intuition. And contrary to the popular image of brutish grunters, these early humans likely cared deeply for one another. We have evidence, archaeological, not speculative, that they tended the injured, buried their dead, even decorated the bodies with red ochre and left behind tokens. Perhaps flowers, perhaps beads, perhaps things we don't understand. This wasn't just disposal, it was ceremony. The first glimmers of what we might dare to call religion, or at least reverence for something beyond. Inside caves from southern France to northern Spain, they painted. Not doodles or random scratches, real art. Majestic bison, delicate deer, wild horses, rendered in vivid ochre, charcoal, and natural pigments. Some even used the curves of the cave walls to give the animals dimension, motion. It wasn't just expression. It was memory, it was myth. Perhaps it was a prayer for the hunt, or a story for a child, or a way to remember the wild world outside. The fact that we don't know makes it more haunting. And there were handprints, so many handprints, mostly of the left hand, with the right used to blow pigment through hollowed bones. A prehistoric signature. I was here, they seem to say. I existed, I mattered, and thousands of years later we still notice. But life wasn't still. As climate warmed and glaciers retreated, some began to experiment with staying in place. Seeds, if planted, grew. Grains, when stored, lasted. It must have felt like magic at first, and so began the slow, patient shift toward agriculture. The greatest revolution that didn't involve a single army. Farming didn't begin in one place. It emerged in pockets. Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, Mesoamerica, China. But the result was the same. Humans traded mobility for stability. It wasn't necessarily easier. In fact, farmers worked harder than foragers. They cleared land, weeded, watered, harvested, stored, and risked everything on the weather. A single drought, a single flood, and the entire village might starve. But the trade-off was population growth, shelter, permanence. Permanent settlements brought other changes. Accumulated waste, for example, which attracted pests. And standing water brought disease. Living close together meant infection spread quickly. The paradox of civilization had begun. More people, more tools, more food, and more problems. Yet still, the villages grew. They sprouted like seeds near rivers and valleys, where soil was rich and trade could flow. These early communities weren't yet cities, but they held the DNA of what cities would become. Shared resources, labor specialization, proto-governments. Someone had to decide how land was used, how disputes were settled, how the grain was stored. Authority was born, slowly and quietly, like moss on a stone. And with authority came hierarchy. Some dug ditches, others built walls, some prayed, some ruled, some remembered. The storytellers, the wise ones, the keepers of tradition, these would one day become scribes, priests, teachers, kings. The rhythms of life became more regular, crops by season, rituals by moon, Birth and death marked not just by time but by meaning. We don't know exactly what these early people believed, but burial sites suggest they believed in something, an afterlife perhaps, or a spirit world, or simply the aching human need to say goodbye properly. By this point, humans had become masters of the material. Stone tools gave way to bronze. Clay pots became painted ceramics. Animal hides were stitched with bone needles into garments. Musical instruments emerged. Flutes made of bird bones, drums of stretched hide. They sang, they mourned, they loved, and eventually they counted. Tally marks scratched into bone, knotted ropes, pebbles arranged in patterns. Mathematics didn't begin with equations, it began with memory, with trying to track who owed what or how many goats were traded last season. As villages swelled into towns and towns into proto-cities, the need to remember grew too large for one mind. Writing wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. But that's for the next chapter. For now, let us end this first step in our journey with a moment, perhaps 10,000 years ago. A warm night, a river nearby, a small cluster of huts, children asleep, smoke curling upward from a central fire, and an elder wrinkled, patient, eyes soft with time telling a story, one they heard long ago, one they now pass on, because even before we wrote it down, history lived in the telling. The story passed on at the fire's edge did more than entertain. It bound generations. Each retelling layered new meaning on old memories, turning lived experience into shared identity. In these first sparks of civilization, language was still fluid, gestures still carried weight, and silence could say as much as a chant. But humanity, restless as ever, was not meant to stay still for long. Even in the earliest communities, the seeds of change were already planted. Agriculture, for all its promise, introduced its own hierarchy. The man who stored the grain was not the same as the man who planted it. Some built, some watched, some governed, and soon some ruled. Power, at first dispersed like seeds on the wind, began to settle into the hands of a few. With it came inequality, not always violent but always creeping. Status was marked not by survival alone, but by the number of clay pots, the size of a dwelling, the shade offered by one's fig tree. And still the river flowed. Domestication followed, not just of plants, but animals. Dogs first, perhaps, lingering near campsites, sniffing at scraps until familiarity became loyalty. Then goats, sheep, cattle. Animals were no longer wild companions, but living tools, providers of milk, wool, strength. They became wealth, sacrifice, symbols, and with them came fences. Fences, of course, meant territory, and territory meant tension. We began to measure our world not just in seasons and stories, but in boundaries. Slowly, across the vast stretches of Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, the Indus Plains, and the Yellow River Basin, real cities began to rise. Mud brick houses clustered close together. Walls emerged, not just for defence but to define. Canals were dug, not only to water crops, but to organise life. In places like Jericho and Shatt al-Huyuk, archaeologists found dense, structured communities layered with centuries of growth, decay, and renewal. These were not just gatherings, they were beginnings of complexity, of specialization, of bureaucracy. With complexity came new tensions, theft, disputes, broken promises. A verbal agreement was no longer enough. The need to record, to account, became urgent. Tokens were used first. Small clay pieces to represent quantities or goods. Then someone, somewhere, pressed a reed into soft clay and left a mark. Not art, not decoration, a sign. A record, the birth of writing. What began as record-keeping, tallies of livestock, lists of grain, inventories of tools, soon evolved. The marks became symbols. The symbols grew into script. It was not beauty that sparked literacy, but necessity. Economics, trade, control. And once words could be stored, they could also be manipulated. History, after all, is never just what happened. It's what someone chose to write down. Religious structures rose alongside civic ones. Temples, once simple altars of stone, became centers of community life. Priests emerged as intermediaries between people and gods, keepers of rituals, readers of omens, interpreters of dreams. The divine was no longer just in the wind or the stars. It was housed, tended, sometimes taxed. Religion too became organized, its symbols carved into clay and stone, its festivals marked by calendars and chants. Faith became tradition, and tradition became law. Not all was sacred, of course. These early cities saw violence, ambition, and vanity. Power shifted with alliances and betrayals. Fortified walls were built not just to keep invaders out, but to keep neighbours in. Trade brought prosperity and envy. Droughts turned cooperation into conflict. And yet, amid the tension, there was brilliance. Metallurgy, the shaping of copper, then bronze into tools, blades, and ornaments. Weaving, once the quiet task of patient hands, grew into a profession. Spindles whirred, dyes stained hands and tunics. Pottery transformed from rough vessels into painted statements. Art, even then, found its place. With time, astronomy took root. Not science as we know it, but observation. The phases of the moon, the rise of particular stars, the predictable return of seasons, calendars were carved, rituals aligned, and stories created to explain the heavens. The sky became a book we couldn't yet read, but tried to. In the midst of the slow surge towards civilization, something subtle yet profound happened. Humans stopped living in the world and began trying to shape it. We no longer accepted our environment passively. We diverted rivers, levelled land, dug irrigation trenches, cleared forests. Not for survival alone, but for order. We wanted predictability, control, permanence. But permanence comes with a price. Disease grew with density, rats with grain, injustice with power. And still people came. To trade, to marry, to pray, to survive. Cities once rare became magnets. Eridu, Uruk, Mohenjo-Daro, Memphis. They pulsed with life, built atop the bones of generations, layered like parchment. In them you could hear the whisper of humanity's future. Here, too, began mythology, not just in painted caves, but etched in lore. The gods had names now, their temples loomed. Their wrath was feared, their blessings sought, stories solidified. Creation myths, epic journeys, moral parables. They weren't written for entertainment, but for instruction, for cohesion, to explain the inexplicable, justify the rules, and remind the people who they were and where they came from. And still, at night, the fires burned. Smaller now, tucked inside stone hearths, but no less essential. The flame had not just kept them warm, it had carried them forward. Through millennia of darkness and dawn, it lit their path from wilderness to wonder. Civilization had not yet reached its peak, but it had begun walking toward it, one dusty footprint at a time. Chapter 3, Citizenship brought belonging, but it also brought burden. To be part of a city meant adhering to its rhythms, obeying its laws, paying its dues, and trusting its walls. But the walls that promised protection also whispered of fragility. No city, no matter how high its towers or sacred its temples, could guard against time. And soon the cities that once shimmered like new constellations began to fall, one by one. The first collapses didn't announce themselves with fanfare. They came quietly at first. A failed harvest, a weak successor, a disrupted trade route. Then the tremors deepened, grain stores emptied, armies shrank, walls were breached, and the myths of eternal rule began to crack like sun-dried mud. Take the Hittites, for instance. Once formidable masters of central Anatolia, they had developed a sophisticated legal system, impressive fortresses, and chariots that thundered across battlefields. Their scribes left behind treaties etched in cuneiform, even correspondence with Egyptian pharaohs. But sometime around the 12th century BCE, their cities emptied, their archives went silent, and their monuments fell to weeds. Then came Mycenaean Greece, a civilization of palaces, gold masks, and heroic lineage. They, too, vanished from written memory for centuries, swallowed by what would later be called a Dark Age. Linear B, their writing system, disappeared, and with it, history paused. Egypt fared better barely. It had already weathered centuries of dynastic shifts and invasions. Its pyramids had stood long before many of these neighbours even dreamed of stone. But even the Nile, so dependable, could not guarantee invulnerability. A mysterious wave of chaos spread across the eastern Mediterranean, a faceless threat recorded only as the sea peoples descended on coasts and deltas, burning, pillaging, dismantling. Pharaohs repelled them, but only just. Temples were looted, fortresses fell, trade collapsed. Egypt limped into survival, forever changed. Historians still debate what exactly caused this cascade of collapse. Was it climate change? Droughts that turned fertile plains into dust bowls? Was it earthquakes that toppled walls and frightened already fragile populations? Internal rebellions sparked by inequality and corruption? Or simply a web of dependencies too tangled to survive when one thread snapped? Most likely, it was all of it. A convergence of slow disasters accelerating into sudden ruin. What's important isn't just that these civilizations fell, it's that they had become complex enough to fail spectacularly. Complexity, after all, isn't the same as strength. A system dependent on finely tuned supply chains, centralized leadership, and rigid hierarchies might appear grand until it's asked to bend. And cities, for all their advancements, were often brittle. They thrived on order, but order could shatter. When collapse came, it wasn't always immediate. In some places, life shrank rather than vanished. Temples turned to ruins, yes, but families still planted crops in their shadows. Trade slowed, but didn't stop. Scribes stopped recording, but oral tradition persisted. Memory flickered, some people moved, others stayed. The cities may have crumbled, but humanity didn't vanish. It simply adapted. In the wake of ruin, new kinds of societies emerged. Some returned to smaller settlements, rediscovering the resilience of simplicity. Others built anew atop the bones of the old. This wasn't the end of civilization. It was a turning of the page. Meanwhile, in other corners of the world, untouched by the Mediterranean unravelling, fresh centres of power were rising. In the Ganges basin, small kingdoms and cities began to flourish, their rituals and philosophies laying the foundation for Indian civilization. In China, the late Shang dynasty carved its rule into tortoise shells and bronze, shaping belief systems that would ripple for millennia. It was during this period that something unexpected happened. Philosophy, the art of asking why, began to flourish alongside governance. In China, as the Zhou dynasty expanded, so too did thought. The chaos of competing warlords and fractured allegiances gave birth to clarity. Laozi spoke of harmony with the Tao, a natural order unspoken and fluid. His writings offered serenity amidst turbulence. On the other hand, Confucius, more structured, urged respect, duty, and hierarchy. Society, he believed, was a chain of relationships, father to son, ruler to subject, elder to youth. If each link held firm, peace would follow. These weren't idle musings, they were answers to collapse. After witnessing centuries of power rise and rot, thinkers began wondering whether swords or temples were really the tools that held society together. Perhaps it was virtue, perhaps ritual, perhaps restraint. Elsewhere, similar reckonings took place. The Hebrew people, exiled, conquered, scattered, yet spiritually bound, began shaping an identity not around land or city walls, but around law and covenant. Their stories, preserved through scripture, spoke of survival not through power, but through purpose. In these moments of rebuilding, the idea of civilization evolved. It was no longer just about ziggurats or palaces. It was about memory, about meaning. The physical could fall, but the philosophical endured. Still, there were places where power refused to pause. In the west, one small city on the banks of the Tiber began to stir. It was surrounded by tribes, often in conflict, frequently overlooked. But it had something different, a stubbornness perhaps, or a knack for adaptation. This city, in time, would become a republic, then an empire. But for now, it was just a collection of huts and hills, unaware of the centuries of history it would one day claim. Rome was not yet built, but it was coming. And with it, a new era of ambition. Before Rome became legend, it was little more than a cluster of wooden huts on 7 hills. Its people weren't emperors or conquerors yet. They were farmers, warriors, craftsmen, living in a world still haunted by the echoes of civilizations that had come and gone. The crumbled ziggurats of Mesopotamia, the empty palaces of Mycenae, and the ruined temples of the Hittites were ancient even to them. But if history had taught anything, it was that ambition often bloomed in unlikely soil. As Rome slowly took shape, it borrowed, absorbed, and repurposed ideas from older cultures. From the Etruscans to the north, they adopted architecture, religious rituals, and even some of their gods. From the Greeks, whose influence was already spreading across the Mediterranean like spilled ink, they learned language, philosophy, and art. Rome wasn't built in a day because it wasn't built alone. It was a cultural scavenger, practical, calculating, and unashamed of its thefts. In its early years, Rome was ruled by kings, or so the stories go. These tales, part myth and part memory, speak of Romulus and Remus, the twin brothers raised by a she-wolf, destined to found a city through bloodshed. Whether true or not, the myth mattered. It gave Romans a sense of destiny, of divine origin. And perhaps more importantly, it gave them a reason to justify whatever came next. Eventually, the Romans grew tired of kings. Around the 6th century BCE, the last monarch was overthrown and the Republic was born. This was a new experiment in governance, not ruled by one man, but by many. Power was divided among consuls, senators, and assemblies. In theory, the system balanced the needs of the patricians, Rome's elite families, and the plebeians, its common citizens. In practice, the lines blurred often. Corruption seeped in, favoritism thrived. But compared to the autocracies of the past, it was a revolution. The Republic gave Rome flexibility. Its leaders could be replaced, its laws debated, its structures adjusted. It could respond to threats with force or diplomacy. And respond it did, relentlessly. Rome pushed outward, slowly at first, conquering neighbours, forging alliances, offering citizenship as both a reward and a trap. You could be Roman, even if you weren't born within its walls. You just had to serve, to pledge, to obey. Roads came next. Not just dirt tracks, but meticulously engineered highways stretching across mountains and marshes. These weren't built for traders or poets, they were built for legions, for discipline, for speed. Roman soldiers could march with brutal efficiency, appearing where no enemy expected them. And once they secured a place, they built cities, forums, aqueducts. Latin followed the sword, and where Latin took root, so did Roman law. That law, codified and exported, became one of Rome's most enduring legacies. The idea that rights could be written, that contracts could be enforced, that property was protected not just by might, but by precedent. This was radical. It didn't eliminate injustice, but it made injustice predictable. That, in the ancient world, was progress. At the same time, far to the east, another kind of empire was solidifying. In China, the Zhou dynasty gave way to the Qin. Here, too, collapse and consolidation danced together. The Qin, under the leadership of the first emperor, unified warring states with ruthless clarity. He standardized currency, weights, and even the width of cart axles. He connected walls to create what would become the Great Wall. He buried scholars who defied him. He built a mausoleum filled with thousands of clay soldiers, each one unique, standing silent guard over a man who had rewritten the meaning of empire. But such control couldn't last. The Qin burned bright and brief. Within a generation it fell, replaced by the Han, who would go on to shape Chinese identity for centuries. Where the Qin ruled through fear, the Han balanced military might with Confucian virtue. They expanded borders, established civil service exams, and opened the Silk Road, connecting east to west in a way the world had never seen. The Silk Road wasn't just a trade route, it was a bloodstream. Along it flowed spices, silk, glass, and gold, but also ideas, languages, diseases, and stories. A merchant in the deserts of Central Asia might trade with a Greek speaking of Plato, then travel east and dine with a Chinese official quoting the Analects. This mingling didn't create unity, but it did create awareness. That other ways of living existed. That the world was bigger than the walls of any one city. Meanwhile, in the south, another civilization thrived. India, where empires like the Maurya and Gupta rose and fell, carrying with them astonishing achievements in mathematics, astronomy, literature, and philosophy. It was in these lands that the concept of zero took shape, where epics like the Mahabharata were composed, and where the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, began to echo across kingdoms. A prince who renounced luxury to understand suffering, he offered not conquest, but stillness. Empires expanded, ideas travelled, but underneath it all, collapse remained an ever-present possibility. The larger a civilization grew, the more it depended on coordination, on food supply, on labour, on loyalty. Any crack could widen, and eventually it always did. The lesson of this period wasn't just that power could rise, it was that it could fall, and rise again, and fall again. The same roads that brought armies could bring invaders. The same scripts that unified law could justify tyranny. The same gods who blessed harvests could be blamed when the rains failed. Yet people endured. After every collapse, there were survivors. Builders, storytellers, mothers raising children among ruins, scribes copying what little remained. The past wasn't erased, it was recycled. And in time, Rome would rise to its greatest heights, and fall. China would fracture and reunite, Egypt would fade, and new forces, some unseen, some barely believed, would begin to shape the fate of humanity. Among them, religion would take on a sharper edge, because soon belief would not just define communities, it would divide them. Chapter 5, Scrolls, Scholars, and Silk Roads. A world interconnected long before ships crossed oceans or clocks ticked across continents, the ancient world was already linked, not by nations or satellites, but by desire. Desire for silk, for gold, for horses, spices, knowledge, survival. Along dusty roads that stretch from the Mediterranean to China's imperial heartlands, camels marched, wheels turned, and languages tangled. This was the Silk Road. Not a single path, but a latticework of trails threading through deserts, mountains, and forgotten kingdoms. Along it moved not just goods, but gods, rumours, medicine, disease, and music. It was commerce, yes, but also connection. A bolt of Chinese silk might pass through a dozen hands before reaching a Roman noble. A merchant from Samarkand could trade in Kashgar, hear stories from India, and dine with diplomats from Baghdad. Even those who never travelled far from their homes lived in a world shaped by distant lands. Spices in their stew, numbers in their ledgers, myths in their calendars. The globe was far from globalized, but it was already humming. The Mongol Empire, under Genghis Khan and his descendants, would make this hum thunder. Uniting the largest land empire in human history, the Mongols didn't just conquer, they organized. Under their rule, caravans could travel more safely, messengers more quickly. A merchant could ride from Persia to China without crossing a single hostile border. And with that security came explosion of trade, of information, of imagination. Yet not everything they carried was welcome. The Black Death moved with the same speed. Originating in the steppes of Central Asia, it hitched rides on fleas, rats, and people. It flowed westward, silent and invisible, until it exploded into Europe like a curse. Entire towns emptied. Fields went unharvested. Corpses piled in churches. Some villages lost half their population. Others vanished entirely. People didn't understand germ theory, but they knew something was wrong. Some blamed the stars. Others accused minorities. Flagellants whipped themselves in the streets, hoping to earn divine mercy. Fear twisted into superstition. And in the eerie quiet that followed Death's March, a new world began to crack through the old, because plague didn't just kill bodies, it killed assumptions. The great universities had no cure. The rich died alongside the poor. The church's promises grew quiet in the face of so much loss. And when survivors emerged from the ashes, they looked at the world differently. If life was so fragile, so cruelly brief, why not question? Why not explore? Why not think? And so they did. In Italy, art and intellect collided in what would be called the Renaissance. A rebirth, yes, but also a reimagining. The ancients were not forgotten. Their manuscripts, long kept safe in Islamic libraries or copied by Christian monks, were dusted off, translated, debated. Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, these thinkers were no longer sacred, they were starting points. Their ideas weren't memorized, they were tested. Painters like Giotto, and later Leonardo, began to study the human form not as symbol, but as structure. Anatomy, shadow, light, these were no longer mystical, they were observable, measurable. Sculptors captured motion in stillness. Architects revived classical forms. And in the corners of workshops and libraries, polymaths sketched machines, dissected cadavers, asked questions the church was reluctant to answer. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century was the catalyst no one saw coming. Words, once chained to monks' hands in vellum scrolls, were now unleashed. Books could be copied in days, not decades. Bibles, poems, maps, heresies. The press democratized thought. It didn't make people wiser, but it made them louder. And louder they became. Exploration took on a new urgency. With the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the last whisper of Roman Byzantium was silenced, and trade routes to Asia became choked by Ottoman tolls. European powers, hungry for spices, silk and glory, began to look west. They didn't yet know how big the world truly was, only that there had to be another way. And so ships were built, compasses calibrated, stars charted. The ocean, once a wall, became a highway, but even before Columbus set sail, trade routes had already transformed the Islamic world into an intellectual superhighway. Cities like Baghdad, Damascus, Fez and Cordoba became centers of translation, preservation and innovation. Greek texts were saved, commented upon and expanded. Algebra, a word born in Arabic, blossomed in the hands of scholars who counted stars and solved practical problems. Medicine advanced. Optics, chemistry, astronomy. The golden age of Islamic science was not a flicker, but a sustained glow that would later ignite Europe's so-called awakening. The irony, of course, is that the West often forgot who kept the lights on during its centuries of sleep. Religion didn't disappear in this new age, it adapted. Reform movements within Catholicism, challenges from Protestantism, debates within Islam, and new sects in Hinduism and Buddhism all reflected the same tension, the old truths facing new questions. Faith was no longer unquestioned. It was examined, and it was challenged most deeply by those who dared to look upward. Astronomy, once a tool of priests, now belonged to mathematicians. Copernicus proposed that the Earth might not be the center of the universe. Galileo, peering through a crude telescope, confirmed it. And for that he was threatened, silenced, watched, because the Earth, after all, had always been sacred. To move it was to move the foundation of everything, but science was not asking for permission anymore. In homes and universities across Europe, experiments were performed not to prove dogma, but to discover truth. Glass lenses revealed microbes. Pressure gauges revealed weather. Bloodletting began to fade. Observation replaced incantation, and slowly, painfully, the world began to measure itself. The Silk Road still carried goods, but now it also carried questions, and those questions would soon tear apart not only empires, but the very fabric of belief itself, because the age of faith was giving way to something dangerous, an age of doubt. Doubt, once whispered in corners, began to speak aloud. It wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was curiosity turned relentless. If the earth revolved around the sun, what else had been misunderstood? If gravity could be measured, what other invisible forces governed the universe? The world had not grown darker, it had grown brighter, painfully so. The flame of inquiry cast long shadows on cathedrals and courts alike. In this emerging world, thinkers were no longer servants of tradition. They were challengers, disruptors, sometimes heretics. Newton, sitting beneath the imagined apple tree, didn't merely ponder falling fruit. He unravelled the mechanics of the cosmos. With calculus, he created a language to describe motion, force, and change. The heavens no longer moved by mystery, they moved by law. And those laws could be written, calculated, and proven. This shift in thinking, the scientific revolution, did not erase belief, but it demanded belief stand beside evidence. Observatories became temples of their own. Microscopes revealed unseen worlds. Chemistry replaced alchemy. Medicine, slowly, tentatively pulled itself away from mysticism. The human body was no longer a vessel of humours, but a system, mapped, dissected, understood. And with understanding came control. Inventions accelerated. Clocks grew more precise. Navigation improved. Paper, once rare, became common. Literacy spread not just among monks or nobles, but merchants, artisans, and eventually peasants. The printing press, once a novelty, was now an engine of transformation. Pamphlets circulated ideas at speeds the old world couldn't match. Revolutions, once plotted in whispers, could now be announced in headlines. It wasn't only science that expanded, it was politics. If natural laws govern the universe, perhaps similar laws could govern society. Thinkers like Locke, Rousseau, and Hobbes asked what it meant to be ruled, to be free, to be human. They didn't agree, not entirely, but their disagreements reshaped the idea of power. Kings were no longer divine by default. Authority had to answer to reason, to consent, to critique. These were dangerous thoughts. In salons and universities, debates flared. In streets and courts, uprisings smouldered. Revolutions followed. The American colonies rejected monarchy. France turned violently on its own crown. Liberty, equality, fraternity. These weren't just slogans. They were knives aimed at centuries of tradition. And still, the world spun faster. The Industrial Revolution did not begin with a bang, but with a hiss of steam. In Britain's damp corners, inventors turned spinning wheels into spinning jennies, watermills into coal-fed engines. Textile factories multiplied. Iron boomed, coal blackened the skies. Cities swelled with workers who traded fields for furnaces. The rhythms of life changed, from seasons to shifts, from sun to schedule. This new world brought unprecedented power. A factory could produce more in a week than a village in a year. A train could cross lands in hours that once took days. But progress came at a cost. Labourers worked 16-hour days in choking air. Children crawled under machines. Rivers turned to poison. Forests vanished. And yet few looked back. Empires saw opportunity. Britain, already enriched by conquest and trade, expanded its reach. The sun never set on it, not because it brought light, but because it claimed everything beneath it. India, carved by railroads and bureaucracy, was restructured into a colony of profit. Africa, once a vast and varied continent of kingdoms, cultures, and complexity, was sliced into lines on a map drawn in European parlours. The age of discovery had become the age of exploitation. The justification came dressed in science. Social Darwinism claimed some races were more evolved. Pseudo-intellectuals ranked humanity by skull size, skin tone, and the shape of noses. Colonialism wasn't theft. It was framed as guidance, as uplift, as destiny. Meanwhile, in colonized lands, resistance simmered. Cultures adapted, rebelled, redefined themselves. Languages blended. Religions collided. And in the shadows of empire, voices began to rise. Technology didn't pause. Telegraph wires stitched continents together. Steamships made oceans manageable. Medicine advanced. Vaccines, anesthetics, antiseptics. Antiseptics. Cities built sewage systems, gas lights, and public parks. And yet, beneath the surface, the old inequalities grew deeper. Women, long confined to shadows, began to speak. First quietly in essays, gatherings, petitions, then loudly, in protests, in marches, in published demands. Suffrage wasn't given. It was taken, piece by force of will. Education spread, but unevenly. Libraries opened. Schools multiplied. But access remained shaped by class, gender, and geography. A girl in London might learn algebra. A boy in rural China might memorize Confucian classics. A woman in Cairo might read secretly. Knowledge was no longer confined, but it wasn't yet free. Religion, too, adapted. Protestant revivals in the West. Reform movements in Islam. Spiritual awakenings in Africa and the Americas. New sects, cults, and philosophies rose to meet the anxieties of modern life. Some offered salvation, others offered escape, and always, behind it all, the past lingered. Ruins were rediscovered, ancient texts retranslated, civilizations once dismissed as savage were re-evaluated. Archaeology emerged, not just as treasure hunting, but as science. The bones of ancestors, the tools of forgotten hands, the foundations of old temples, all whispered stories no historian had written. Humanity began to realize that its story was older, deeper, and more interconnected than anyone had imagined. The Silk Road, once a trade route, became a symbol that everything had always been connected, that cultures didn't evolve in isolation, but in dialogue, in conflict, in exchange. The age of reason hadn't replaced the past, it had reawakened it. But the modern world, fast and glowing, was already leaning into something new. Not just industrial, not just colonial, but mechanized, digitized, globalized. A world about to go to war, not just with others, but with itself. Chapter 6. The turn of the 20th century didn't arrive with subtlety. It came wrapped in wires and pistons, crackling with telegraphs, rumbling with steam, and bristling with empire. Cities had grown into beasts of iron and smoke. Streets pulsed with trams. Factories roared with machinery, and chimneys stabbed upward like declarations. Progress no longer whispered, it thundered, and yet, beneath that thundering, something fragile pulsed. Human lives still beat in rhythm with older fears. Families gathered around evening fires. Children were born in back rooms, not hospitals. Superstitions lingered in corners where light bulbs hadn't yet reached. Progress was never evenly poured. It dripped, it pooled, it skipped entire nations. But its direction felt inevitable. Europe, flush with industrial wealth, stood at the apex of global power. Its empires stretched across continents, ruling hundreds of millions. Maps were splashed with British red, French blue, Spanish gold. Colonial officials in linen suits plotted railroads in lands they barely understood. Native customs were labelled backward, spiritual systems recast as myth, and labour systems quietly converted into slavery by another name. Meanwhile, in drawing rooms and salons, the ruling classes celebrated modernity. Electricity lit opera houses. Telephones chirped in government offices. Cars, still temperamental machines, began replacing carriages. The future felt sculpted and tangible, like something built, brick by brick, in Europe's own image. But technology wasn't the only thing advancing. So was tension. Alliances formed behind closed doors. Military budgets swelled under the pretense of peace. Nationalism, once a quiet pride, mutated into something volatile. Newspapers sold fear in bold headlines. Old empires trembled on unsteady legs. The Austro-Hungarian patchwork, the brittle Ottoman holdouts, even the once mighty Qing in China. The world was packed tightly, like a room filled with gas and the faint scent of smoke. And then someone lit a match. In 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, an heir to a fading throne, ignited a war so vast, so absurdly mechanized, that it redrew the shape of suffering. The First World War wasn't just a conflict of empires. It was a collision of progress and brutality. Machine guns chewed through soldiers faster than strategies could adapt. Barbed wire sliced through open fields. Gas curled into trenches, silent and deadly. Horses charged tanks. Generals issued orders using 19th century tactics against 20th century weapons. And in the mud-soaked trenches of the Western Front, young men who had grown up in the electric promise of modern life bled into soil they would never leave. Nations sacrificed generations. Cities emptied. Families received telegrams instead of sons. Yet even amid war, invention marched on. Aircraft, primitive and fragile, took to the skies. Submarines stalked the oceans. Radios transmitted from field to field. War, it turned out, was a cruel accelerant. And when the guns finally fell silent in 1918, nothing had been settled. Millions were dead. Borders had shifted. Empires collapsed. The Ottoman Empire fractured. The Austro-Hungarian monarchy dissolved. Germany, humiliated and starving, simmered with resentment. And in the gaps left behind, new ideologies slithered. In Russia, revolution had swept away the Tsars. What replaced them was not the democracy many had hoped for, but something far more ruthless. Under Lenin and later Stalin, communism took root in blood-soaked soil. The Tsar's family was executed. Landowners were stripped of their holdings. Dissenters were imprisoned, exiled, or executed. A state built on equality became a state built on fear. The West, meanwhile, danced through the 1920s with the kind of optimism only the deluded can muster. Jazz filled the air. Skyscrapers clawed at the clouds. Markets soared. Radios and refrigerators entered homes. It was a glittering surface stretched thin over deep fractures. Because behind the music, debt swelled. Rural communities withered. Colonial tensions flared. And in 1929, the illusion cracked. The stock market crashed. Banks failed. Breadlines formed. Hope withered. The Great Depression wasn't just an economic crisis. It was a reckoning. As democratic governments floundered, more dangerous figures stepped forward. They didn't offer truth. They offered certainty. Mussolini in Italy, with his black shirts and dreams of Roman revival. Hitler in Germany, promising purity, order, and vengeance wrapped in swastikas and staged parades. The crowd didn't need convincing. They needed someone to blame. The machinery of the modern world, so carefully built for industry, was repurposed for death. Propaganda became an art form. Planes dropped leaflets before bombs. Youth were indoctrinated before they were armed. Factories churned out tanks instead of tractors. And then, once again, the world caught fire. World War II began in 1939, but its sparks were scattered long before. Poland fell first, crushed by blitzkrieg. France collapsed in weeks. Britain held on. Russia, caught off guard, reeled. And across the seas, the United States watched, until December 1941, when Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor pulled it into the global inferno. The war was not only vast, it was intimate. Civilians were targets. Cities were firebombed. Families disappeared overnight. And beneath it all, in hidden camps and quiet forests, the Holocaust unfolded. A genocide so methodical, so industrialized, that it nearly defied comprehension. 6 million Jews. Millions of others. Gassed. Shot. Starved. Erased. When the Allies finally won in 1945, the victory was soaked in ash. Berlin lay in ruins. Tokyo smouldered. Hiroshima and Nagasaki glowed with radioactive silence. Two cities destroyed by a new invention, the atomic bomb. A weapon so powerful, it split atoms and remade the balance of global power. The world had entered a new era, one where annihilation could come not with armies, but with a single decision. Yet somehow, life went on. Refugees returned to craters once called homes. Nations rebuilt, some with help, others with blood. The United Nations was formed, a fragile hope for peace. The Cold War began. Less a war, more a long shadow cast by fear. East and West divided. Walls rose. Ideologies solidified. And in the background, the hum of progress resumed. Jet engines, television, rockets, DNA. The world was wounded, but not quiet. It was hurtling towards something else, something unseen. The age of empires had ended, but the empire of technology had only begun. The Cold War was not a war in the traditional sense. It was a contest of nerves, symbols, and systems. Two ideologies faced each other like clenched fists, one clad in stars and stripes, the other wrapped in the hammer and sickle. The United States and the Soviet Union, allies only years earlier, now circled each other in a high-stakes chess match where the prize was global dominance and the penalty was annihilation. And the board wasn't just Earth. It stretched into the stars. The space race began not with a dream but with fear. When the Soviets launched Sputnik in 1957, a tiny beeping metal sphere orbiting the planet, it pierced the illusion of American supremacy. If they could put a satellite up there, what else could they send down here? The US scrambled. NASA was born. Schools refocused on math and science. A generation grew up with its eyes turned skyward, watching rockets rise like promises. By 1969, American boots touched the moon. Neil Armstrong's cautious step was watched by millions, not just as a feat of engineering, but as a cultural victory. It was humanity's giant leap, but it also reinforced the technological rift that now defined the second half of the 20th century. But while astronauts danced on lunar dust, back on Earth, reality remained stubborn. Proxy wars erupted in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, places where Cold War ideology bled real blood. Superpowers played puppeteers, while local populations paid the price. Millions were displaced, conscripted or killed in battles that technically weren't wars, but bore all the scars of them. In the West, consumerism surged. The 1950s promised suburban dreams, picket fences, and televised dinners. By the 1980s, this had matured into malls, microwaves, and the strange miracle of the personal computer. Silicon Valley became the new empire, one that conquered not with tanks, but with bytes. Meanwhile, behind the Iron Curtain, life was grimmer. Surveillance was a way of life. Neighbors feared neighbors. Censorship filtered every word. But even within the Soviet bloc, cracks began to form. Dissidents whispered. Underground literature circulated. Walls may have been built of concrete, but their foundations weakened with every muffled question. And then, in 1989, history turned again. East Germans flooded the Berlin Wall, not with weapons, but with hammers. They chipped away at decades of division, their cheers louder than any bomb. The wall fell. The curtain lifted, and within 2 years, the Soviet Union itself dissolved, collapsing under the weight of stagnation, rebellion, and history's slow grind. For the first time in decades, the Cold War was over. The world didn't end in mushroom clouds. Instead, it melted into a strange optimism. The 1990s promised globalization, internet revolutions, and the illusion that maybe, just maybe, peace could be permanent. But history doesn't stop. It mutates. The internet, once a scientific tool, became a cultural tsunami. By the early 2000s, it had reshaped communication, commerce, identity. Borders blurred. A meme in Tokyo became a joke in Texas. A blog post could topple a regime. Information was no longer power. It was chaos. And in that chaos, new threats emerged. On September 11, 2001, the United States was struck in a way no one had imagined. Skyscrapers collapsed. Thousands died. The world watched in horror as terror became televised. The war on terror began, but this wasn't the clean conflict of old. It was asymmetric, elusive. Drones replaced pilots. Cities became battlegrounds of ideology, not just strategy. Civilians bore the brunt again. The 21st century didn't come with flying cars. It came with surveillance states, financial crashes, rising oceans, and smartphones in every pocket. Empires didn't fall, they digitized. Control moved from governments to algorithms. Your attention became currency. Likes became validation. Truth became optional. Meanwhile, climate change loomed larger. Once a distant concern, it turned urgent. Fires consumed forests. Storms battered coastlines. Glaciers retreated. And yet, action remains slow-trapped in the gears of politics and profit. Civilization, for all its progress, seemed unable to escape its own shadow. But still, there was light. Movements rose. Voices that had long been silenced, indigenous, marginalized, colonized, began to reclaim their place in the narrative. History books were rewritten. Statues came down. The past was no longer a single story. It was a chorus. And technology, for all its terrors, still held wonder. Scientists decoded the human genome. Probes touched distant planets. Art, culture, and absurdity flourished online in ways no one had predicted. In the midst of complexity, humanity remained staggeringly creative. Yet even now, as you sit or lie somewhere, listening to the slow stream of memory, history continues to unfold. Somewhere, a child is born into a world wired and warm. Somewhere else, a culture faces extinction. In one place, laughter fills a marketplace. In another, sirens echo down empty streets. We are not finished. Not even close. From cave fires to great cities, from stone tools to quantum code, the arc of civilization is neither straight nor smooth. It's a labyrinth of hope and horror, triumph and tragedy. But it's ours, shared, messy, magnificent. And as long as we remember it, whisper it, question it, dream through it, it lives on. Chapter 7. What we call civilization often forgets its silent architects. Beneath the grand narratives of kings and empires, wars and walls, exist the subtle, persistent forces that shape daily life. Water systems built by unnamed engineers, harvests coaxed from stubborn soil by women whose names never made it into record, and traditions carried through whispers rather than texts. It's in these forgotten layers that history becomes human again. While we celebrate monumental breakthroughs, we too often forget that those moments stood on the shoulders of centuries of quiet refinement, trial, and survival. Consider the thread of agriculture. It began not as a sudden shift but a gradual negotiation with nature. People tried, failed, adapted. Over generations, the wild became slightly more tame, and the tame became tradition. Crops didn't just feed cities. They shaped belief systems, festivals, gender roles. A surplus of grain allowed specialization. Artisans, priests, soldiers. They all emerged not from divine sparks, but because someone else grew more wheat than they needed. Even the earliest temples weren't just places of worship. They were granaries, calendars, and community centers rolled into one. And then there's trade. We imagine it in caravans crossing vast deserts. But trade began as something much smaller. A carved bead here, a hunk of salt there. Over time, networks formed, spanning continents. The Silk Road didn't just carry silk. It carried languages, diseases, philosophies, even recipes. Tomatoes didn't originate in Italy. Chilies weren't always Indian. History's menu is one of migration, misunderstanding, and marvelous reinvention. But not all connections were peaceful. With trade came conquest, with wealth came theft, with contact came exploitation. For every empire that rose with glory, there were tribes displaced, cultures erased, and ecosystems disrupted. The story of humanity's rise is also the story of others' erasure, and sometimes that erasure was intentional. Entire civilizations have been lost, not because they were inferior or doomed, but because someone wrote over them. Scripts burned, temples looted, names replaced. The victors not only rewrote history, they often redesigned maps. What was once a sacred river might become a border. What was once a language might become a secret, whispered only among elders, then lost to silence. Yet remnants remain. In architecture, folk songs, burial customs, and even everyday phrases, the ghosts of forgotten societies linger. A child's lullaby in one corner of the world may carry echoes of a migration thousands of years old. A weaving pattern passed down for generations may depict constellations now barely visible due to city lights. And then there are the small rebellions that shaped great outcomes. We often speak of revolutions as singular moments, storming of a palace, signing of a treaty. But most real revolutions begin far earlier and last far longer. They're born in kitchens, taverns, temples, and alleys. In questions asked quietly at first, then louder. In refusals to bow, to marry, to worship, to stay silent. Women have played these roles endlessly, invisibly. Not just as mothers or muses, but as thinkers, healers, strategists, spies. For millennia, their labour-powered economies, their insight shaped policy behind curtains, their courage fueled resistance in times of war. Yet they were reduced to footnotes when they were mentioned at all. Only recently has history begun to correct this, but the gaps remain wide, waiting to be stitched together. Language, too, tells its tale. Every sentence you speak carries fossils. The structure of your grammar, the rhythm of your phrasing, the metaphors you choose. They all trace lineages stretching across continents and centuries. Languages die every month, some with no written record. When they do, entire ways of seeing the world vanish with them. A word for a certain kind of snow, a verb that means to grieve while planting, a noun that describes the silence between thunderclaps. These are not just words, they are windows, and we haven't even begun to grapple with how colonialism changed everything. Maps redrawn by rulers who had never set foot on the land. Names imposed on mountains and rivers already known by dozens of titles. Education systems built to erase. Religious structures used to justify cruelty. This wasn't just political, it was psychological. An entire architecture of shame was built into language, skin, accent, even the idea of history itself. Still, resistance persisted, not just in uprisings and armed struggle, but in stories. Oral traditions kept alive despite punishment. Songs encoded with warnings. Dances performed at night in secret. Tattoos that held spiritual significance, even after missionaries labelled them sinful. Survival itself became rebellion. And through all of this, ordinary life continued. Children were born, markets bustled, lovers met in shadows, and elders remembered. In every corner of the globe, people found ways to live with dignity amid oppression. They laughed. They created. They buried their dead with care. They held festivals that mocked their rulers and prayed to gods that were banned. These weren't just coping mechanisms. They were culture. By the time we arrive at the modern era, we are already standing on a mountain of such invisible histories. The rise of the nation-state, the invention of printing presses, the spread of industrial machines, all of it happened not in a vacuum, but in a world still echoing with ancient songs and buried stories. So when we say civilization, we should whisper it, because it is not a single light in the darkness. It's a mosaic, cracked, reassembled, incomplete, but stunning when seen up close. The further you zoom in, the more you realize that every brick and every monument was once held by a hand with a story. Every road, every law, every coin and calendar, built not just by the famous, but by the forgotten. And still we build, still we forget, still we remember. The Enlightenment may have laid the intellectual foundation for modernity, but its legacy was anything but neat. As the ink dried on the declarations of liberty, equality, and reason, empires redoubled their conquests in the name of those very principles. The same century that gave us Rousseau and Voltaire also gave us plundered palaces in India, slave markets in the Americas, and opium dens funded by imperial greed. The duality of man, brilliant and brutal, was becoming a recurring theme in the march of civilization. And then the machines roared to life. With the Industrial Revolution came a seismic shift unlike any before. No longer did humans depend solely on muscle, wind, or water to power the world. Now steam hissed from engines that drove locomotives across continents, churned textile mills that chewed through cotton, and breathed life into cities that grew taller and filthier with every decade. Coal smoke stained the skies above Manchester and Pittsburgh, while the clanging of steel replaced birdsong. Nature was no longer a silent partner. It was a resource, and soon a casualty. The human body changed too. No longer shaped by fields and farms, generations began to stoop not under the weight of grain, but of factory schedules and soot-laden air. Children worked beneath spinning jennies, fingers raw from endless hours. Men coughed into blackened handkerchiefs. Women lost themselves in machines that didn't stop, not even for grief. The myth of progress was seductive, but what was lost in the hum of machines could not always be recovered. Still, cities flourished. London, Paris, Berlin, each one a pulsing nerve centre of wealth, culture, and contradiction. Sewers were dug, even as slums exploded. Gaslights illuminated streets where horses still trotted, and revolutionaries whispered. There was a sense, faint but growing, that the old world was cracking under the pressure of something vast and new. It wasn't just steam rising from the chimneys, it was ambition, unchecked and unrelenting. Education spread, though unevenly. Literacy became a tool of power, not just privilege. Newspapers carried not just gossip, but agitation. Revolutions weren't confined to guillotines anymore. They simmered in pamphlets and labour meetings, in the minds of women denied the vote, and in colonies stretched thin by arrogance. The colonised read their conquerors' books, and began to dream dangerously. And then came the war. Not a clash of kings, or a border squabble, but a cataclysm that swallowed empires whole. World War I cracked the facade of European superiority. Trench warfare, brutal, stagnant, senseless, erased an entire generation of youth. Men died for inches of mud. Horses bolted at the sound of machine guns. The modern age, birthed by steel and steam, now feasted on its own children. It wasn't heroic. It was industrialized slaughter. Gas drifted through barbed wire. Empires fell with less dignity than a collapsing circus tent. The aftermath was no peace. It was a pause, a deep breath before an even greater storm. The interwar years saw democracies wobble, economies implode, and ideologies sharpen like knives. Fascism bloomed where fear festered. In Germany, in Italy, in Japan, entire societies wrapped themselves in myth, grievance, and militarism. Meanwhile, communism rose like a promise and a threat, drawing lines between comrades and capitalists. World War II wasn't just a conflict, it was a reckoning. Civilizations that had proclaimed themselves enlightened now bombed civilians by the tens of thousands. Auschwitz stood as a dark cathedral to industrial evil, organized, recorded, and executed with bureaucratic precision. Cities like Dresden and Hiroshima burned with a heat that melted morality. It was no longer enough to be victorious. Nations sought annihilation, yet from the ashes rose a strange hope. The United Nations was born not in triumph but in trauma. Former enemies now sat at tables pretending peace. Colonial empires, exhausted and embarrassed, began to unravel, not gracefully, but inevitably. From India to Africa to Southeast Asia, the demand was the same: sovereignty, dignity, and the right to shape one's own future. But the Cold War froze those dreams in ideological amber. For decades, the world teetered on a razor's edge. nuclear arsenals promised extinction at the push of a button. Proxy wars raged in jungles and deserts. Civil wars bled into global conflicts. Every chess move between the US and USSR came at the cost of lives far from Washington or Moscow. The Third World became the battlefield of the first two. Meanwhile, another revolution simmered. Not political, not industrial, but digital. Silicon replaced steel. Code became currency. The internet, first a military project, exploded into a global nervous system. Borders blurred as data moved faster than laws could catch it. For the first time, a teenager with a dial-up modem could outmaneuver an empire, not with bombs, but with information. The power shifted, invisibly but irrevocably. Societies reshaped themselves once more. Old jobs vanished. New ones, remote, digital, absurdly named, took their place. Human attention became the commodity. Screens replaced fields. The average person now had more access to knowledge than a Renaissance king, but also less certainty than a medieval peasant. And yet, here we are, scratching at glass screens for meaning, whispering into the void for connection, building smarter machines while struggling to remember how to be human. Because for all the revolutions, agricultural, industrial, digital, one thing remains unchanged: the deep, aching desire to understand ourselves. To look at the arc of human civilization not as a straight line of progress, but as a haunted spiral of triumphs and tragedies ever circling the same truths. We love, we destroy, we rebuild, we forget. But perhaps, in the act of remembering, in the calm quiet of reflection, we edge closer to understanding why this long, winding story was worth telling in the first place. Chapter 8. But of course, the story didn't stop at understanding. As the 20th century stumbled into the 21st, civilization entered a phase so complex, so paradoxical, that even the most sophisticated minds struggled to define it. It wasn't simply post-industrial or post-modern, it was post-certainty. The old grand narratives collapsed under their own contradictions. Religion, science, nationalism, even liberal democracy, all were questioned, revised, redefined. The more connected the world became, the more fragmented it felt. Globalization brought paradoxes. On one hand, it shrank the world. Mangoes from India could sit beside Alaskan salmon in a New York supermarket. Ideas, memes, and revolutions zipped across fiber optic cables. But on the other hand, it amplified division. Tribes reformed in digital spaces. People unfriended family members over politics. Truth itself became slippery. Not because it disappeared, but because it was buried under avalanches of curated belief systems. And yet, amid the chaos, there was movement. Social justice found new languages, new battlegrounds. The margins pushed their way into the center. Voices once silenced began to write their own chapters in civilization's history. Indigenous thinkers, queer artists, disabled scholars, climate activists, and refugees refusing erasure. It wasn't utopia, but it was noise, vital, necessary noise against centuries of silence. Technological progress, once measured in horsepower and steel, now accelerated at the speed of thought. Artificial intelligence began to mimic, and sometimes surpass, human cognition. CRISPR gave us the power to edit genes. Quantum computers promised to unravel mysteries faster than we could pose them. But, as ever, the question wasn't what we could do, but what we should. Civilization had never been short on capability. It had always been short on wisdom. Meanwhile, the planet began to protest. Climate change didn't arrive like a Hollywood apocalypse. It came like a fever, gradual, undeniable, deadly. Coral reefs bleached, ice caps wept, storms grew angrier, droughts crueler. And beneath it all, the quiet knowledge that civilizations had risen and fallen before, often because they ignored the warning signs written in wind, water, and soil. The myth that humans were separate from nature cracked. We were never passengers. We were always part of the ship. and we were boring holes in the hull. In cities, life moved at a pace that defied biology. The average urban dweller woke not with the sun, but with a buzz from a device. Days were ruled by rectangles, phones, laptops, windows, screens within screens. Information poured in like floodwater, wars, trends, prices, deaths, memes. But meaning? That was harder to come by. Civilization had built the greatest libraries, but fewer people knew how to read deeply anymore. Not books, not others, not even themselves. And yet, still, we built. Massive megastructures in the deserts, underground data centers cooled by glacial air, space telescopes that peered into the births of galaxies, robots that performed surgery with trembling precision, satellites that could track a migrating whale from orbit. There was awe still, but it was often buried beneath routine. A miracle becomes mundane if you live inside it long enough. War didn't vanish. It just evolved. Drones replaced foot soldiers, hackers replaced spies. Propaganda no longer needed leaflets, it needed algorithms. Battles were fought in comment sections and stock markets. Entire countries could be destabilized by fake news and financial manipulation. But the victims remained the same. Civilians, the poor, the displaced, the unheard. At the same time, something stranger began to happen. Nostalgia became a cultural force. People yearned for imagined pasts, times when things were simpler, purer, better. Politicians weaponized that yearning, offering easy answers to complex problems. But history, if it teaches anything, warns us, the past was never simple. It was just conveniently forgotten. And amid all of it, pandemics, protests, economic shocks, civilization kept muttering its central question, what does it mean to be human? The ancient philosophers asked it in dusty forums. Medieval mystics whispered it in candlelit monasteries. Enlightenment thinkers debated it in salons. Now, we asked it through tweets and TED Talks, through therapy sessions and YouTube rants. We tried to answer it with apps, diets, manifestos, pills, pilgrimages. But perhaps the answer wasn't in defining human, but in embracing its contradictions, flawed and magnificent, cruel and kind, terrified and endlessly curious. We stared into telescopes and saw galaxies that would never touch us. We stared into microscopes and saw the viruses that could destroy us. We sent robots to Mars and forgot to check on our neighbours. We could decode DNA, but not always love. Civilization, it seemed, wasn't a destination. It was a mirror, sometimes cracked, sometimes fogged, but always reflecting back what we feared and what we hoped. And hope, our hope, remained. Fragile but stubborn. Woven into lullabies, street murals, protest chants, graduation speeches, the first cry of a newborn in a city still blinking after blackout. Even when systems failed, humans often didn't. Strangers pulled each other from rubble. Scientists shared data instead of patents. Artists reminded us that beauty didn't need permission. Teachers taught through war zones. Nurses held hands when families couldn't. We kept telling stories, around campfires, in novels, through films, in songs hummed to babies. Even this very script you're hearing, is part of that ancient impulse to say, we were here, and maybe, just maybe, to matter. Because civilizations don't end with bang or whimper. They evolve, they adapt, or sometimes they vanish. Not with fire, but with forgetting. The ruins left behind aren't always stone or steel. Sometimes they're digital. Ghost towns of abandoned websites, extinct emojis, lost messages floating in server farms. But as long as we remember, really remember, not just facts and timelines, but empathy, nuance and truth, then the long story of civilization isn't over. It's merely changing shape. And you, dear listener, are part of it. A chapter still being written, a line still unfolding. Even as humanity continues to script its next line, It does so not on a blank page, but one stained with the ink of its past. The tools have changed. Digital pens instead of chisels, satellite signals instead of smoke. But the urgency remains the same: to be seen, to be understood, to shape tomorrow. And yet, perhaps for the first time in history, civilization has become self-aware. It can now track its own heartbeat, its carbon breath, its swelling cities, its dying coral. It watches itself through sensors and satellites, through climate graphs and neural scans. It sees the cracks in its armor, and sometimes even admits them. This self-awareness is not without anxiety. For every achievement, there's a price. The same systems that allowed a teenager in Mumbai to learn quantum physics from a lecture in MIT also fueled algorithmic echo chambers that deepened societal rifts. The same platforms that let artists share beauty also became breeding grounds for disinformation and cruelty. Civilization, it turns out, is not just a sum of what we build. It's a reflection of what we allow. And now we allow machines to make choices, sometimes without fully understanding how they reached them. Artificial intelligence doesn't arrive like a villain in a sci-fi film. It seeps in quietly into hospitals, courts, recruitment systems, education, warfare. It promises efficiency, but often inherits our biases. A facial recognition system can diagnose disease better than a human doctor, yet fail to recognize certain skin tones. A predictive policing algorithm can map crime before it happens, yet disproportionately target communities that have always been watched. In rushing toward optimization, civilization risks automating injustice. Still, the dream persists, that technology might finally free us from drudgery, from inequality, from mortality. Some imagine a future where minds upload into code, where consciousness becomes data. Others find this idea grotesque, a desecration of the soul. But isn't that the hallmark of every phase of civilization? A collision between those who push the boundary and those who guard the sacred? Between Prometheus and the priesthood? Meanwhile, beneath the stars, a quieter transformation unfolds. A return, not to tradition, but to grounding. More people plant food in their balconies. They talk of slow living, digital detox, community. These aren't just trends, they're symptoms. Civilization may be accelerating, but humans are still built for seasons, for tactile things. The smell of wet earth, the warmth of another hand, the silence between words. In many ways, the arc of civilization has bent toward abstraction. From barter to coins to credit to cryptocurrency. From land ownership to intellectual property to virtual real estate. From face-to-face to voice call to emoji. We've become experts at converting the physical into the symbolic. Yet the hunger for realness has never left us. It's why people hike without phones. Why vinyl made a comeback. Why handwritten letters can still bring tears. And then there's the earth, always there but never quiet. Rising temperatures are no longer predictions, they're facts. Sea levels creep higher. Species vanish, forests gasp. Civilization, in its arrogance, once imagined it could save the planet. But the truth is starker. The planet will outlive us. What's in question is not Earth's future, it's ours. The Anthropocene, some call it, an epoch where humans are the dominant geological force. But dominance isn't victory, it's responsibility. The same intellect that split the atom also decoded DNA. The same species that burned coal also harnessed wind. Civilization is capable of destruction, yes, but also, of course, correction. The question is, will we act in time? History suggests we might, but only after the edge is visible. The fall of Rome, the Dust Bowl, the ozone hole, action often follows collapse. Yet, in moments of crisis, humans have shown a rare capacity to come together. The ozone healed. Pandemics spurred cooperation. Cities reinvented themselves. It's not inevitability we lack, it's urgency. And here's the twist. The more we advanced, the more we circled back. Smart cities now look to ancient planning, walkability, mixed-use spaces, community gardens. Modern medicine increasingly studies traditional healing. Digital interfaces mimic tactile gestures. It's as if civilization, after sprinting toward the future, paused, turned, and asked, "What did we miss back there?" Perhaps what we missed was rhythm, not just of nature, but of being. The breath between thoughts. The pause before response. The gap between stimulus and reaction where choice lives. Our ancestors built temples not just for gods, but for silence. They painted caves not just to record, but to feel. Maybe, in this dizzying age of innovation, we're slowly remembering what they knew, that progress without meaning is noise. That meaning isn't found in grand monuments or stock prices, but in the micro moments. A child's question, an elder's laugh, a meal shared without screens. Civilization may span continents, but it's stitched together by things that can't be graphed. Love, wonder, story. And so, we tell them. Around dinner tables, on podcasts, through code, in dance. Stories that warn, stories that heal, stories that stitch the past to the now, to the maybe. We tell them not to escape the world, but to stay awake within it. Because stories, unlike statistics, remember the soul. This story, the one you've listened to now across hours or nights or scattered naps, isn't complete. It can't be, because civilization is still happening. In refugee camps, in startups, in street protests, in lab benches, in lullabies. The great story of us is unwritten in places we haven't yet looked. But if there's one thread that binds it all, it's this: we try. Against absurd odds, through contradiction and chaos, we try. To build, to understand, to belong, to matter. And in that trying, civilization lives, not as a place or a system or a victory, but as a verb. To civilize. To create something a little more humane than what came before. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the measure of a civilization isn't how high its towers rise, or how fast its machines hum, but how often it asks, who is still left out? What do we still not know? Who haven't we heard? What else could we become? Chapter 9. If there is one recurring pattern in the grand arc of human civilization, it is the cycle of forgetting and remembering. Just as knowledge builds layer upon layer, so too does ignorance return in waves. Sometimes disguised as tradition, other times cloaked in innovation. As the modern world steps further into digital terrain, it simultaneously drags behind the echo of ancient rhythms, a longing for balance, a whisper of humility, a reckoning with excess. We once marvelled at our control over fire and flood. Now we tremble at our inability to regulate the climate we've disrupted. But how did we go from worshipping nature to fearing its retaliation? The answer lies in centuries of conquest, colonization, and unchecked extraction. Empires, in their hunger for more land, more gold, more bodies, carved into the earth like it was infinite. Forests were cleared, not just for farming, but to display dominance. Rivers were dammed not only for irrigation, but to exert control over time itself. Somewhere along the line, we mistook dominion for destiny, and by the time we realized we were building on a foundation of sand, the tide had already begun to rise. Still, it would be wrong to assume that all was decay. Even amid this relentless march, people resisted. They reclaimed language, preserved rituals, saved seeds, whispered stories into the ears of children. In quiet corners, knowledge was kept alive. By grandmothers who knew which herbs eased childbirth. By monks who illuminated scrolls through war and fire. By enslaved men and women who sang freedom coded into spirituals. Civilization didn't just grow from pyramids and palaces. It endured through lullabies and recipes, tattoos and totems. As industrialization surged ahead, cities transformed from tight-knit neighborhoods to labyrinths of glass and steel. Skyscrapers sliced the clouds, while underground tunnels mirrored ancient catacombs, only this time filled with electric trains instead of the bones of the dead. We built up and down, fast and wide, until space itself seemed irrelevant. But in the process, the human scale got lost. Streets grew louder, faces grew lonelier, and time itself became currency. Civilization was no longer something you felt, it became something you paid for. And yet cracks formed in the glass. The myth of endless growth began to fray. People asked why progress looked like burnout, why the wealth of the few cost the breath of the many, why the machines that once promised leisure only demanded more speed. The digital age, for all its brilliance, brought its own sickness, a restlessness of the soul. Screens offered connection, but often delivered comparison. Algorithms offered choices, but quietly narrowed vision. In trying to know everything, civilization risked knowing nothing deeply. Still, hope did not vanish. Instead, it took subtler forms. A resurgence of ancestral practices, movements that refused to forget the land, communities that bartered time instead of money, scientists who looked not just to space, but to fungi, coral, and whales for answers. Civilization, once obsessed with conquest, began, albeit hesitantly, to learn the value of coexistence. And as global crises loomed, the lines between history and future blurred. Suddenly, the lessons of the past weren't dusty relics, they were blueprints for survival. The shift wasn't uniform. In some places, history was rewritten to erase harm. In others, it was weaponized to justify it. But where truth persisted, it did so not with fanfare, but with endurance. Museums transformed from halls of conquest to spaces of reflection. Universities began to teach not just who won, but at what cost. Artists turned trauma into resistance. And slowly, painfully, civilization learned a truth older than its oldest ruins, that power without compassion is ruinous, and that knowledge without wisdom is a dangerous kind of blindness. In this reawakening, the role of memory became sacred. Not nostalgia, but remembrance. To remember what it means to be human. To remember the scent of soil before concrete. The stories that shaped a people before borders did. The rituals that honored death as much as life. Civilization was not reborn, but it began to molt, shedding illusions, reclaiming truths. Not all at once, not everywhere, but enough. And through it all, the children watched. They asked why rivers had no fish, why schools taught wars but not peace, why the moon couldn't always be seen in the sky. Civilization's future, it turned out, wasn't in quantum computing or Martian colonies, but in whether it could answer those questions with honesty, whether it could look into the eyes of the next generation and say, "We tried." Because in the end, no matter how vast the cities or how precise the data, civilization lives or dies in the realm of meaning. In whether people feel seen, in whether cultures are respected, in whether love is easier than hate. It's easy to forget this amid blueprints and budgets. But history remembers. Always. And so, civilization stands at the edge. Not of collapse, but of decision. The tools are here. The knowledge is here. What remains is choice. To continue the cycle of rise and ruin, or to write a different chapter. One where progress does not mean forgetting. One where the ruins we leave behind are not warnings, but altars. But what does it mean to write a different chapter? That question haunted the early 21st century, like a ghost hovering behind every innovation, every summit, every promise of a better tomorrow. Progress had become a religion, but its prophets were tired, and the faithful were losing sleep. The same civilization that once celebrated the steam engine and the light bulb now stared blankly at climate reports and mental health statistics. Beneath the glowing screens and endless noise, a quiet truth pulsed like a heartbeat. Something had gone deeply wrong. And yet, paradoxically, never before had so many voices been heard. The rise of digital platforms gave people the power to speak across continents, to challenge old narratives, to unearth buried histories. Indigenous communities streamed ancient ceremonies. Activists live broadcast revolutions. Farmers in one hemisphere shared survival tips with those in another. Civilization was no longer dictated from marble halls. It was being shaped in kitchen table podcasts, comment threads, and street murals. The centre had not held, but maybe it didn't need to. Maybe there never was one centre at all. Of course, this decentralisation came with its own shadows. Misinformation thrived where trust had decayed. The echo chambers grew louder. Algorithms, designed to optimise engagement, slowly divorced users from nuance. In a rush to digitise every aspect of life, we outsourced memory, flattened identity, gamified attention. History was no longer something you studied. It became a meme, a trend, a 2-minute explainer video squeezed between ads for productivity apps and weight loss gummies. Civilization had more access to information than ever, and yet comprehension often slipped further from reach. Still, the pendulum swung. Not fast, but perceptibly. People began craving depth. Vinyl records made a comeback. Books reappeared in public spaces. Slow food, long walks, eye contact. There was a hunger not just for progress, but for presence. As the digital tide flooded every corner of life, a resistance emerged, not violent or radical, but intentional. The resistance of planting trees you won't live to sit under, of teaching endangered languages to children, of restoring wetlands because they matter, even if no one profits. Governments, often clumsy and late to adapt, began to shift as well. Policies once deemed radical became inevitable. Cities redesigned themselves for walking instead of traffic. Rivers were given legal personhood. Some nations scrapped GDP as the sole metric of success, replacing it with happiness indexes or environmental health. For the first time in centuries, civilization began asking not what can we build next, but what should we unbuild first? And that was no small thing. But transformation isn't measured in news cycles. It's etched into the long, slow arc of culture. And culture, despite its speed in the digital age, still roots itself in stories. Not just the ones we tell, but the ones we believe. For centuries, we told the story of the lone hero, the conqueror, the inventor who changed the world. Now, new stories emerged, of community care, of collective memory, of interdependence. The hero was no longer the warrior king, but the grandmother who fed a neighborhood, the protester who held the line, the teacher who stayed after class. And as these stories rippled outward, so too did the definition of civilization. It was no longer just domes and documents, markets and monuments. It was coral reefs, endangered dialects, seed banks, lullabies, laughter in refugee camps, the resilience of people whose names would never be carved in stone. Civilization was no longer a single river, but a delta. Many tributaries, sometimes muddy, always moving. Some would dry out, others would overflow, but together they kept the whole alive. Even the way we remembered history began to change, not just as a timeline of inventions and wars, but as a mirror revealing how we've treated the earth, each other, ourselves. Museums added new wings. Textbooks rewrote chapters. Descendants of colonizers acknowledged stolen wealth. Truth commissions surfaced not only in post-conflict nations but in global institutions. The past could no longer be buried under marble and myth. Civilization began the painful work of accounting, not to punish, but to heal. And from that healing, a strange kind of beauty emerged. Not utopia, not perfection, but humility. A willingness to ask again what it means to thrive. For some, it meant growing food with their hands. For others, it meant coding open-source tools that protected democracy. For many, it meant simply surviving with dignity. Civilization wasn't about reaching a pinnacle. It was about holding the line against despair, choosing kindness when it was easier not to, remembering that every generation is a bridge, not a destination. As the chapter of the Anthropocene unfolded, humanity stood aware, perhaps for the first time, of its full power. To destroy, to renew, to forget, to remember. And somewhere, under ancient skies or buzzing power lines, a child looked up and asked a question no one could fully answer. What came before us? And civilization, still learning how to listen, tried to respond. Not with grand declarations, but with stories, with songs, with the quiet, difficult truth. That to be civilized isn't to dominate, it is to care, to notice, to build not just for profit, but for beauty, not just for now, but for the next. Because while pyramids may crumble and data may decay, meaning lingers in how we treat each other, in whether we show up, in whether we remember. And in the end, it won't be our tallest towers or deepest algorithms that define us. It will be our willingness to listen to the past, to speak gently to the future, and to make this present flawed, fleeting human matter. Chapter 10. The world didn't end in fire or ice. It ended in noise. And from that noise, something new began to stir. At the close of the modern age, as cities sprawled and satellites webbed the planet in invisible threads, humans came to face the one question they had long buried under monuments and markets. What now? What does a civilization do when it knows too much, moves too fast, and feels too little? When the archives are full, but the soul is thin, the answer didn't come in a treaty or a TED talk. It came in smaller moments. A community garden planted where a parking lot once baked in summer heat. A forgotten melody revived by a teenager sampling their grandmother's lullaby. A public library refusing to replace books with branded tablets. A teacher in a war zone drawing constellations on a blackboard to remind their students that the sky, at least, remains shared. In these moments, scattered and soft, civilization began to remember itself, not as a tower, but as a tapestry. It wasn't always pretty. The old systems fought to persist. Governments spun new jargon to rebrand the same extraction. Tech giants spoke of responsible AI while swallowing entire economies. Culture wars raged like never before, with truth treated as a sideshow act. And the planet, patient and powerful, responded, not with words, but with wildfires, rising seas, vanished species, heat that cracked concrete, cold that arrived out of season. Nature had been a silent partner in humanity's journey, but it was silent no more. Still, the human instinct to build didn't fade, it evolved. Architecture turned toward regenerative design. Cities made space for animals to pass through again. Skyscrapers hummed with vertical farms. Schools taught emotional literacy alongside engineering. Technology didn't vanish, it was reimagined. Devices were designed not just to consume time, but to respect it. A new kind of intelligence emerged, not artificial, but ancestral. One that valued silence, rest, the dignity of limits. This shift didn't happen everywhere or all at once. Some regions clung to old power structures, doubling down on surveillance and spectacle. But even in the most unlikely places, you'd find pockets of renewal. A fisherwoman restoring mangroves, a poet mentoring ex-prisoners, a solar technician teaching elders how to fix panels without relying on corporations. Civilization became less about dominance and more about stewardship, less about legacy, more about responsibility. And so, the final chapter of human civilization was not about collapse. It was about coherence. Not about utopia, but about returning to balance, to meaning, to the art of being enough. Civilization, once defined by what it could conquer, began to be defined by what it could heal. The wounds of empire, of industry, of endless growth, none could be undone. But they could be acknowledged, they could be taught, they could be remembered, so that the future wouldn't stumble over the same stones again. Even language changed. Words that had been worn thin by centuries of misuse, progress, success, development, were replaced with newer, gentler ones. Regeneration, interbeing, kinship, joy. For the first time in generations, children grew up not afraid of the future, but curious about it. Their textbooks didn't begin with war, but with wonder. Their maps didn't end at borders. Their stories weren't all about survival. They were about care, play, belonging. And those children grew. They became artists, gardeners, engineers, mediators. They understood that civilization wasn't inherited. It was enacted, day by day, meal by meal, apology by apology. They laughed at the idea that humans were separate from nature. They rolled their eyes at the myth of endless growth. They knew that wealth wasn't measured in square footage or followers, but in time. Time to sit, to listen, to change. So what did the end of civilization look like? It looked like a beginning. It looked like old songs sung anew. Like elders teaching children to listen to the wind. Like neighborhoods where no one died alone. Like rivers with rights, robots with restraint, rituals that no algorithm could replicate. The cathedrals were still there, of course, but they were not the point. The point was what lived between them, what happened after. And when future historians look back, not to extract lessons or scold mistakes, but simply to understand, they may not find a grand monument marking the end of the Anthropocene. They may find a field where machines once stood, now buzzing with bees. A reclaimed coal mine turned into a forest. A forgotten server room transformed into a meditation hall. They may not see glory, but they will see grace. Because civilization, like the humans who create it, is not a linear thing. It is cyclical, messy, resilient, prone to error, capable of great harm and greater kindness. It does not end in a bang or a whimper, but in a breath. And in that breath, a choice. Not to repeat, not to regret, but to remember, rebuild, and rest. So, if you've made it this far, drifting somewhere between thought and sleep, between history and dream, know this. You are part of that story, not as a spectator, but as a scribe. Not as a relic, but as a root. Civilization does not live in towers or texts. It lives in how you care, in what you choose to restore, in the soft, stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe, we've only just begun. Civilization did not dissolve into ruin overnight. It faded, reframed itself, and then found a pulse again. Not in power grids or parliaments, but in the human urge to continue, to pass something good along. It had taken millennia for the species to understand that the most profound structures ever built were not monuments, nor markets, nor machines, but relationships between people, places, memory, and meaning. In this final movement of the grand symphony that began with flint and fire, the rhythm changed. It slowed, it softened. The crescendo of the industrial centuries gave way to quieter harmonies. People began to speak differently. They questioned words that had once guided the world: progress, civilized, primitive, even future. These words had shaped pyramids and pipelines and policies, but they'd also carved scars into continents. And now, those words were carefully retired, like old tools, respected for what they had built, but no longer fit for what came next. The legacy of human civilization, once measured in what it conquered, shifted toward what it could regenerate. This wasn't a utopia. It was still full of grief, inequity, unfinished repairs. But it was honest. There was no longer a global race to be the biggest or fastest or richest. That game had ended, not with a trophy, but with exhaustion. And the prize for slowing down was something ancient and rare: presence. Villages began to look like sanctuaries, not because they were rich, but because they were rooted. You could walk through one and hear languages that hadn't been spoken in centuries, now sung by children on their way to schools without bells. Food wasn't flown from across the planet. It grew nearby, tasted of soil and season. Houses didn't tower, they welcomed with wide porches and shared meals. Energy wasn't extracted. It was harvested with humility from sun, wind, tides. And people worked, yes, but they also rested, not out of laziness, but out of wisdom. The old model of endless hustle had collapsed under its own weight. In its place, rhythms, rituals, respect. The digital world didn't vanish, it matured. Instead of colonizing attention, it began to protect it. Algorithms, once trained to trigger, were reprogrammed to support. Social platforms evolved into memory gardens, story circles, mentorship webs. Artificial intelligence no longer tried to imitate humanity. It collaborated with it, quietly, without ego. The line between machine and magic began to blur, not because technology became gods, but because humans remembered they never were. Even death changed. No longer feared as failure, it was integrated, honoured. Cemeteries turned into forests, ashes returned to soil. Funerals became festivals of remembrance, not for status, but for impact. Who had you helped? What had you healed? What seeds had you left, and would they bloom? This world wasn't designed by committee or manifesto. It emerged like a mycelium beneath, between, beyond the visible. Led by caregivers, artists, rebels, and elders who whispered truths that never needed permission. Their blueprint wasn't found in blueprints. It was in lullabies, protests, recipes, games, handshakes. Civilization had finally stopped shouting and started listening. The textbooks now told a fuller story. They didn't skip over the slavery, the smog, the greed, the wars. But they also didn't end there. They included the resilience of cultures that refused to die, the courage of whistleblowers, the grace of communities that welcomed strangers with nothing but warmth. The students were taught not just to memorize history, but to mourn it, question it, reshape it, and most of all, to realize they were part of it. There were still cities, of course, but they no longer devoured the land. They danced with it. Skyscrapers wore vines like jewelry. Roads made room for rivers. Noise yielded to silent zones. Architecture no longer screamed dominance. It hummed with humility. The idea that nature was a resource? Obsolete. Now, nature was kin. The forests were not lungs. They were elders. The oceans were not trade routes. They were teachers. And those who had once been pushed to the margins, the indigenous, the disabled, the poor, the forgotten, were now at the centre of design, not as charity, but as necessity, because their stories had always held the keys. The world didn't need more visionaries. It needed listeners, restorers, story keepers. This was not a golden age, but it was a grown age. And so, after all the empires, inventions, tragedies, and triumphs, after stone, bronze, iron, coal, code, humanity arrived not at a destination, but at a realization. That civilization wasn't something to be built once and for all. It was a practice, a promise renewed every day to live with more kindness than cruelty, to create more beauty than harm, to leave the world not richer but more alive. In the final pages of the human story as we knew it, there were no fireworks, no singular saviours, just a quiet evening somewhere, a child planting a seed beside a grandparent, a breeze moving through a window where once stood a wall, a stranger offering help not for reward, but because they could. And you, still awake perhaps, still listening, are part of this, not as an observer, but as an author. Civilization does not end with silence. It ends with a whisper, then a breath, and then again. With wonder,